Hello and welcome to Section 4 of Chapter 38, the Stormy 60s for the American Pageant for U.S. History. Today we're looking at the LBJ brand on the presidency through Black Panthers. Not Wakanda, sorry. We'll get to it. We're going to get into this with the tragedy of the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. The presidency fell to Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy was in Dallas trying to gain support for the Civil Rights Bill. And so, as kind of a dying wish, President Johnson vowed to pass Kennedy's bill. Johnson, a veteran of Congress who'd been there for 20-something years, he knew how it worked. He used personal favors, he used intimidation, succeeded. The following July 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. This is one of the crown jewels of the civil rights movement. It's one of the crowning achievements. It's a big, big deal. It banned all Jim Crow laws. It banned discrimination against race, color, sex, religion, and national origin, effectively nationally making Jim Crow laws and Jaime Crow in the Southwest illegal. It was later he signed an executive order to take affirmative action against discrimination, which is one of the controversial thing trying to help those that are underprivileged, give them a fair chance in situations. There's a picture of President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act into law with Martin Luther King Jr. behind him. Here's the Civil Rights Act, 1964, proposed by President Kennedy, signed into law July 2nd, 1964. Excuse me, I swear it's not coronavirus. It's got something in my throat. This is from the Johnson Presidential Library, which is in Austin, Texas. Here's a picture of my wacky son pretending to sign it with President Johnson. So LBJ, he's a little more ambitious than President Kennedy. His plan is called the Great Society. He spent 22 years in Congress. He knew how to get things done. He knew how to use personal favors. He knew how to intimidate people. He was great at motivating people. He liked to use the Johnson treatment, where he would just harangue you and talk to you and question you and just kind of violate your personal space, get right up into you and talk to you and say, you're going to pass this, aren't you? I know this is making you feel uncomfortable right now. It's making me feel uncomfortable and my heart's racing. So finally you'd go, fine, whatever you want. I don't care. Just leave me alone. He had a Texas-sized ego. Typo. So Johnson had a Texas-sized ego. He was full of himself. He's very crude, very obscene. He loved to curse. He once urinated in the sink in front of a Korean dignitary because he thought it was funny. He skinny dipped in the White House pool. He wouldn't eat steak unless it was cut in the shape of Texas. He's just a weird guy. One of his favorite things to do is he had an amphibious car. And he would take people to his Texas ranch, and he loved to drive at a lake and then pretend that the brakes were out, and then, oh my gosh, we're gonna crash, and then it would go into the water and it would start floating, and he would laugh as the person was panicking. He also liked to, drink 6 packs of beer, put it in his, big Cadillac with the Texas bull horns, and drive down dirt roads to scare the bejesus out of people to get him what he wanted to do. It's on private property, so I guess he couldn't be arrested. I don't know. In 1964, he declared war on poverty. He declared unconditional war on poverty in June 1964. This is a part of the Great Society program. Some of the things that he instituted, he passed over 500 pieces of domestic legislation, many of which are still around today. He started Head Start, Upward Bound, Job Corps, Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, which is kind of a Peace Corps here in the United States, Medicare, Medicaid. These are cornerstones of our national government in terms of the socialist or welfare state to help people out. To help out cities and schools, he founded HUD, Housing and Urban Development, to offer low-income housing to help people that didn't have enough money to get proper housing. It's a cabinet position. It's still around today. That was in 1966. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act radically changed how schools were funded to really kind of make schools in the modern entities that they are today. And so our modern high schools, our modern primary schools largely modeled after this Great Society. This is Johnson giving his treatment, his intimidation methods, and then he had gallbladder surgery, so he was showing off his scars to the press because he's very crude and obscene, and he just didn't care. Forrest Gump, you remember Forrest Gump showed him directly in the buttocks and showed off his wound. It was funny because it was LBJ who liked to do that. I'm sorry, my kid's weird. The election of 1964, Lyndon Johnson runs against the Republican, a very extreme conservative named Barry Goldwater at Arizona. Goldwater attacked the New Deal. He attacked the Great Society. This is one of the most notorious campaigns in history. Some of the campaign commercials that come out of this era are just terrible. And it was a pretty, mudslinging, very dirty election. One of the worst campaigns in history. LBJ won in a landslide, though. People liked what he was doing. During the 1964 election, in August 1964, you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which U.S. destroyers off the coast of North Vietnam were attacked by North Vietnamese ships. Because of this, Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is essentially a blank check for LBJ to escalate involvement in Vietnam. At the time, Johnson didn't think it was worth fighting for. Secret tapes have revealed this, but didn't know how to get out. Wanted an excuse to try to elevate using troops, not just military advisors and funding to Vietnam, but actually send American troops to put boots on the ground. And so the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which some people think was staged or provoked, provided that for the president to get what he wanted. It gave him the power to do what he wished in Vietnam, which we'll learn a little bit more about in the next video. This is the electoral map of 1964. Kind of shows the proportional kind of view of these states here. You can see it was a very large margin, popular vote and the electoral vote. So over 500 pieces of legislation was passed. Much of it still around today. Poverty rate declined over the next decade. His war on poverty, it improved it. It didn't succeed. Poverty has not been wiped off the United States' dockets. He did pass the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which abolished the quota system that had been in place since 1921. It also doubled the number of immigrants that were allowed to enter the country annually, so opening up the borders for more and more people to come to the U.S. The sources of immigration shifted from Europe to largely Latin America and Asia during the Johnson administration, which continued all the way through the 90s and to this day. This is the poverty rate. You can see it drastically declined from 1960 to the 1970s. The peaks you see when economic recessions happen. It'd be kind of scary to see that here in 2020 with our economic shutdown because of the coronavirus. So 1964, after they passed the Civil Rights Bill, becomes known as Freedom Summer for African Americans. Still, the next piece, so that is social equality that they achieved. The next component was political equality. Many African Americans could not vote. Even though the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote in 1870, through grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests, you name it, intimidation and fear from the KKK, African Americans in the South largely were disenfranchised, which is a fancy way to say they did not vote. They weren't allowed to vote. And so you had poll taxes. People had to pay to vote. Literacy test. You had to take a test to prove that you were competent in American government and history and culture to vote. These were nearly impossible to pass. Even people that did pass them, they would lose their results. And then other discriminatory laws that kept African Americans away from the voting booths. And so the movement in 1964 to 1965 was to register African Americans to vote. It was such a daunting task. It was almost impossible to vote. Doctors, people with PhDs, lawyers could not pass these literacy tests. So most African Americans in the South didn't even bother to register to vote. There were freedom workers in the first 3 days of the Freedom Summer that were murdered in the South, and so it was kind of a shocking, just a revelation that things were still not equal in the South, even though the Civil Rights Act had been passed. The Voter Education Project, or VEP, joined together the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC, and CORE, and they did these mock elections where they showed, look, we are capable of voting. We can have our own elections. They didn't count, but it was kind of like a trial run, like a scrimmage. maybe when you guys were younger, you did kids voting when you were in elementary school or middle school, and you voted and you felt like you did your part. It didn't actually vote, but it showed you could, use your civic duty properly. And so because of this, between 62 and 64, 700,000 African Americans registered to vote. Still, at one point, only 6.7% of people in Mississippi, African Americans, could vote. SNCC and Bob Moses specifically targeted this state as one of the most violent, most notorious states in the South in terms of segregation and violence at that time. The Council of Federated Organizations, or COFO, held mock elections in 1963, as I alluded to, and it worked. This is a book I have from my graduate work. It showed the percentage of voting age blacks. It's estimated that were registered to vote. 1940, 0.4, 1947, 0.9, 4% in 52, 5.2%. I mean, even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, it's only 6.7%. So the 24th Amendment was a big success. It banned poll taxes in 1964. Then you have the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, which broke away from the Democrats. They wanted delegates in the Democratic National Convention in 1964. They were offered 2 spots, and this is out of hundreds. And so they broke away and did their own thing. Then you have the Selma, Alabama March in 1965. The plan was to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, 50 miles away to register people to vote. The first attempt was attacked by the police. Jimmy Lee Jackson was actually, unfortunately, tragically murdered in this protest. The second attempt they tried to do, they were attacked as well by the police. After numerous court battles, the march commenced on March 21st, 1965. It led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by the national government. The heightened awareness of the voting deficiencies in the South led LBJ to act, and so the second crown jewel of the Civil Rights Act, or Civil Rights Movement, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Within 7 years, the number of African Americans in office grew 10 times. It really allowed African Americans to vote, to register to vote. It really kind of scaled back a lot of the South's rules to keep them from voting. 55% of eligible voters in Mississippi were registered to vote by 1969. It was a stunning success. This is a picture from Selma, Alabama. Shortly after this, the police attacked these marchers with billy clubs, with tear gas. It's an ugly, ugly scene. There's a movie called Selma about it. You should probably check it out. So many thought that this process was too slow. I mean, African Americans fought for a year to sit on a bus where they wanted with the Montgomery bus boycott. They fought all summer just for the right to ride buses across state lines. Sit-ins, going to jail, being arrested for the right to sit at the lunch counter. Many thought this is taking too long. And some people didn't like the non-violent element of Martin Luther King Jr. They thought that these were minor successes. Now, this is largely before the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. Malcolm X is a voice who did not want integration. He did not want whites and blacks to mix. He wanted a separate black society. He was born Malcolm Little. He converted to the Nation of Islam while he was in jail. He changed his name to X to symbolize that he did not know what his African surname was. Little was assigned to him. Malcolm Little, his ancestors, were owned by a white family named Little, and so they put their last name on their former slaves or their slaves to denote ownership. He was taught by Elijah Muhammad, who created the Black Muslim movement. They stated, this is a Black Muslim movement, that the whites were a mutant race of blue-eyed devils created by mad black scientists to persecute black people. This isn't as warm and fuzzy as I Have a Dream. They wanted to create a separate black America, and they called for a cultural revolution. He made African Americans see themselves as black instead of Negroes. Dr. King did not like to use the term black because in the English language, black has many negative connotations. Violence was okay. If you're going to be attacked, fight back. In fact, the quote of Malcolm X was, by any means necessary. Equality and justice by any means necessary. Eventually, he splits with the Nation of Islam in 1964. He makes a pilgrimage to Mecca and becomes a man of peace, a man of religion, a true Muslim instead of a black Muslim of this movement. He changes his name from Malcolm X to Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. And then sadly, tragically because of this, he was killed by rival black Muslims in 1965. possibly for changing his stance. He respected Martin Luther King Jr. He's not an enemy of Martin Luther King Jr. If you like the X-Men, Professor X is modeled loosely on Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X is the kind of the inspiration for Magneto. Both wanted equality for mutants, fighting for the same thing, but kind of different methods. Same thing, Dr. King, Malcolm X, fighting for equality through different methods. This is a picture of By Any Means Necessary. This is Dr. King and Malcolm X meeting each other, and Malcolm X holding an assault rifle. Black Power. Stokely Carmichael, the chairman of SNCC, coined the term. Basically that, we need to be, it's kind of like Marcus Garvey, be proud of who you are. His quote was, the only way we're going to stop them white men from whipping us is to take over. We've been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we're going to start saying is Black Power, and it's symbolized by a raised fist, often with a black glove. At this 1968 Olympics, two American athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, showed the Black Power sign and were suspended and banned from the Olympic Village for this. They did it on the medal stand. There was a white man from Australia, Peter Norman, who also participated in a protest called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. None of them wore shoes. It was a whole political thing. But the two African Americans who did the Black Power, they were banned from the Olympic Village. They were sent home. People didn't think that politics and sports should mix. And here's the famous picture of them. They are wearing their Olympic human rights buttons here. This is Peter Norman. A full-length picture would show that they do not have shoes on. That's all I have for today. If you have any questions, let me know.